You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 14th of May, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
US President Donald Trump welcomes Syria back onto the world stage. Too soon? Norway wonders what to spend all its money on, and should a modern British education include rifle drills? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Patty Cohen and Robin Lustig will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, about the challenges of keeping the literary pages alive. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by global economics correspondent at the New York Times, Patty Cohen, and by Robin Lustig, the journalist, broadcaster, former presenter of The World Tonight on Radio 4. Hello to you both.
Andrew.
Robin, you have recently been across the Atlantic.
I have, all the way to the United States of America. I got in and I got out and lived to tell the tale.
Well, those are remarkable accomplishments in themselves in the current context. Getting in and out was relatively problem-free?
It was absolutely problem-free. I confess I was a little nervous because I have been known in the past to write quite critically about the current president of the United States, and I have read all the stories about various people who have run into trouble at borders. But there was no problem at all. I think probably because I'm old and I'm white, and I was travelling with my wife, and she charmed the immigration officer, of course, and so we were waved through without a problem.
So you didn't have to recourse to such tacks as, God, no, not that Robin Lustig, he's dreadful.
It did cross my mind. No, I didn't wipe my phone either, which a number of friends suggested I should do, but I thought, no, I'm not going that final step.
But in the interregnum between the getting in and the getting out, how was the trip?
It was fine. I was there for family reasons. A family member is sick at the moment, so we went to see her. I was only in and around Boston, Massachusetts, which isn't exactly the heart of Trump territory, so I didn't run into anybody with whom I had to have a vigorous political debate.
But
it was fine.
You did visit the heart of the American Revolution.
I did. I actually went to the Old North Bridge in Concord, Massachusetts, where supposedly the first shots were fired in 1775.
But was it all worth it?
It was.
Is the question that they're now asking themselves. Patty, you, though from America, have not been quite that far recently. You have, however, travelled across London.
I have. Actually, in many ways, April was the cruelest month for me this year because I had to move very unexpectedly.
What do you mean cruel? Everybody enjoys moving house, especially if they have to do it unexpectedly.
Yes, well, and not only that, the apartment that I was staying in before was completely furnished, whereas I came here without, I still have an apartment with my husband in New York. So I basically, in a week's time, had to online furnish an entire flat.
So it's quite exciting for you right now to be sitting on a chair, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Well, you can enjoy that for the next half an hour or so. We will start with the current Middle Eastern tour of US President Donald Trump, which today reaches Qatar, potential furnishers of the next Air Force One, and landlords of a $5.5 billion golf resort project attached to a prominent American family whose surname alert listeners may be able to guess. Before departing his previous stop, Riyadh, however, President Trump shook hands with President Ahmed al-Sharaa of Syria, who late last year led the lightning conquest of the country that unloaded overstaying tyrant Bashar al-Assad and punted him into exile in Russia. Trump suggested to al-Sharaa that signing Syria up to the Abraham Accords might be a good start. Quite a bit to unpack there, Robin. But first of all, is there anything at all wrong in and of itself with the President of the United States meeting the new President of Syria?
No, on the contrary, I think it's a very good thing. Potentially, it could be really historic. A lot depends, of course, on what happens in Syria over the coming months and years. But if it remains relatively peaceful, and if the endorsement of President Trump unlocks substantial foreign investment for Syria, particularly from the Gulf states, but also from Turkey and possibly from Egypt and elsewhere, then yeah, that will make a huge difference, but it is a big if.
Patty, Trump has also announced the lifting of US sanctions on Syria. Rather sweetly, Syria has suggested that perhaps the skyline of Damascus could be adorned by a Trump tower. I think they've understood their man, certainly. But again, there's not a lot to dislike about that prospect, as Robin outlines it in and of itself. But is Syria signing up to the Abraham Accords all that likely?
I mean, I think really there is so many obstacles that are facing Syria right now. I mean, the country was completely devastated. 90%, I think, is living in poverty right now. All of its infrastructure and agricultural base were mostly destroyed. It has practically zero foreign reserves in its central bank, and was essentially paralyzed from doing anything to improve its situation because of these sanctions, which other countries, but basically led by the United States. So the single most important thing that anyone in the world could do to help Syria was actually what Trump did, which was to lift those sanctions. Because before then, you had a relative in Syria. You couldn't send them money. The IMF or World Bank couldn't loan them any money or anything. So Syria has a long way to go just to kind of even get itself on its feet, I think, before they're going to start thinking about signing accords with Israel. And also at this point, normalization with Israel seems further away than it ever has, given the situation with Gaza. I mean, even the prime, pushers of the Abraham Accords have backed out now, essentially, or at least put it on hold, like Saudi Arabia.
Forget, Andrew, that Israel is currently occupying Syrian territory.
Indeed,
it's got
so.
Military forces on Syrian land. It's also bombing Syria fairly regularly. There's a lot that's going to happen before Syria will even consider normalizing relations with Israel.
I'm not saying it's not a reach, not least because it would be probably a pretty tricky thing for al-Sharaa to sell to the Syrian people, given history and indeed given the present. But that factor you raise there, Robin, the fact that since the fall of Assad, Israel has descended from the Golan Heights on the Syrian side of the border and bitten off a few more chunks of Syria. But you can see, and certainly you can imagine, that Trump, real estate mogul that he is, sees the parameters of a deal there, i.e. in exchange for Israel giving Syria back that which it has taken, was the phrase I wanted, in the last few months, normalization between Jerusalem and Damascus.
Yeah, but I think one has to recognize that with the current state of relations between Israel and the Arab world, and actually Israel and the United States, which is not as good as it was, the fact that Trump isn't going to Israel on this trip is really quite remarkable. The idea he shakes the hands of the Syrian president but doesn't pop in to say hello to Bibi Netanyahu is quite extraordinary. I don't see it happening anytime soon. There are so many hurdles to cross. But one day, yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if Israel could actually sign a peace agreement with another one of its neighbours?
On that subject of Trump's non-attendance in Israel, Patty, what do we read into that? Because it is, I think, quite unusual for a US president visiting this vicinity not to drop in on Israel. Is it possible that Trump, and he would not be the first US president, has just got to the point of regarding Israel and Palestine and thinking, God, I'm not getting involved in that?
Well, he's already gotten involved in it from the moment he kind of came to office, and basically really, I think, withdrew any pressure on Israel to lift its military campaign.
Not that there was a lot.
But whatever there was, I mean, certainly I would argue that Israel was more constrained under the Biden administration than it has been under Trump. And you've seen an incredible ratcheting up of the war, and also blocking all humanitarian assistance. And I also think because of all that, as I was saying before, normalization with Israel is kind of off the table, or at least it's on the back burner now. So, you can always kind of Kremlinology read into should he have visited, not. I mean, certainly Saudi Arabia was the first foreign trip he took during his first trip, and this is definitely something kind of focused on the Gulf. But I wouldn't read too much into that at the moment.
Well, staying sort of in the Middle East, and a chaotic manoeuvre by Switzerland, which as of tomorrow will impose a ban on Hamas, which may seem like the least of Hamas's problems right now, and indeed of Switzerland's generally, the country never having been known as a roiling hotbed of Islamist extremism. But it is significant on a couple of fronts. It represents a minor breach of Switzerland's usual stance of obdurate neutrality, and will make it harder for whatever remains of Hamas to use Switzerland as a centre for its financing, and easier for Switzerland to refuse entry to or bounce out associated undesirables. Robin, is it slightly odd that it has taken this long? The loophole through which Switzerland has regarded this situation is that though the EU designated Hamas a terror organisation nearly 25 years ago, the UN, for obvious political reasons, quite hasn't. And therefore Switzerland thinks, it's okay, really.
I think it's more than slightly odd. I think it's very odd. And the timing is sort of even odder, because it comes, as we've just been talking about, on the day that President Trump shakes the hand of a man who until relatively recently was regarded as one of the world's most dangerous terrorists, who used to be a prisoner of the Americans, who was closely affiliated with al-Qaeda. And for Switzerland now to say, we're taking action against Hamas, it's a bit sort of stable door and horses bolting, isn't it?
Well, it is being framed as well, Patty, as a response to October 7th, 2023. It is currently May 14th, 2025.
I mean, I don't know the specifics of it. As I understand it from the news reports, this decision was made after October 7th, and like a lot of...
Quite a while after October 7th.
Yes, but, like a lot of things in terms of legislation, and often takes a while for a law to go into effect. Lots of legislatures approve all kinds of laws that then don't take effect until a year or two or even more later than that. Secondly, my guess is, and again, this is really speculation because I haven't looked at the figures, but with the rise of kind of global financial hubs like in the UAE, I wondered to what degree even how much Hamas money has been going through Switzerland anymore. And so it may be one of those where it's a kind of nice gesture to make, but it doesn't really have much of an impact one way or the other, either on Hamas's finances or on the Swiss.
Yeah, the grand noble gesture, Robin, which costs us absolutely nothing, always the best kind to make. But that notwithstanding, does this represent any kind of shift in Switzerland's neutrality creed? Because it's kind of picking a side.
Sort of, but if it is a shift, it's a pretty small shift, I would suggest. I think in the past, Switzerland has actually moved much further in opening up its banking operations to scrutiny than it was tempted to do before international pressure became too great to resist. I'm not sure how significant this is. I think Hamas has other problems to deal with. And again, you contrast what Switzerland has done, and I take Patty's point, absolutely. This legislation has been on the books for quite a while. Mr. Trump, in effect, has just been almost negotiating directly with Hamas to win the freedom of an American-Israeli hostage held by Hamas. So there is a lot going on, and as I say, I think Hamas has other issues which will mean much more potential damage to it than this Swiss move.
I mean, is there or was there perhaps, Patty, a case to be made that if you're going to be neutral, then you do have to protect that at all costs? I mean, it might have been a self-serving rationale, but is there any case that something like this does compromise or undermine Switzerland as a mediator, deal-maker, negotiator? They did mediate the talks between Hamas and Fatah in 2016, which weren't, of course, a diplomatic triumph, but you really can't fault Switzerland for having tried.
I mean, I don't know. I think there are certainly actions, and not that the Swiss has acted at them before. As we know, it's certainly a crucial repository for finance and such during Nazi Germany's reign. But I mean, I think there are certain kind of international situations that, whether it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that are kind of clearly seen as aggressive. And I don't know in this particular case that it really compromises Switzerland's status as a neutral country.
Well, to Norway now, presently grappling with a problem of the sort which most other countries can only wish they had, i.e. how best to spend the contents of a more or less bottomless pit of money. Norway's sovereign wealth fund is worth somewhere in the vicinity of $1.8 trillion. A few Norwegians have wistfully suggested it could be spent giving every citizen $325,000, though one does not need to be an economist to anticipate inflationary consequences of any such move. Instead, a citizens' panel was appointed, and their suggestions are in. They include decent chunks of spending on education, renewable energy, and foreign aid. Robin, what kind of tree-hugging, kumbaya-chanting hippies are we talking about here?
My kind. I find this the most encouraging story of the day. I've always been in favour of citizens' panels and citizens' assemblies. I do by and large believe in the wisdom of crowds, although looking at some recent election results, one might have cause to question that element of faith. But yeah, I mean, I do find it encouraging that this is not a group of people who've said, just give us lower taxes, hand out the dosh so we can spend it. They've said, let's spend it on things which will be for the good of society as a whole and for the good of the planet. And I applaud them.
I just want to pick up that idea there about citizens' assemblies, conventions, etc. as a means of asking the public. Do you think it does work better than just every so often plonking a referendum on the table and saying, what do you think? If there is in the middle of this an actual deliberation. I'm thinking back to the Australian referendum on the Republic in 1999, prior to which there was a sort of constitutional convention was gathered in Canberra. People representing various parts of Australian society all turned up and pitched in, and the level of debate and discussion, I have to say, was surprisingly rarefied.
I think the reason I'm so much in favour of them is it's an extremely effective way of enabling people to get directly involved in political decision-making. An occasional election, an occasional referendum isn't enough, and I am convinced that one of the reasons why there is so little faith in democratic processes in so many countries around the world is that people don't feel they're being listened to. And if you offer them an opportunity and say, come along to your local village hall, come along to your library, come along to your church hall, whatever it might be, and we will listen to what you have to say in small groups, I think that's very empowering.
Is there also a thing attached to that, Patty, that it means people do have to talk to each other. They have to have a discussion. In this particular instance, 56 Norwegians from various strata of society were chosen to represent the country. And they are probably 56 people who might not otherwise have spoken to each other, but they did actually have to have a conversation.
Right, absolutely. And also, just to pick up on the point that Robin made, the fact is, unlike a referendum or even an election sometimes, which is kind of made on a snap decision in which people don't really have a full grasp, perhaps, of all the policy implications. Here you had deliberations, in-depth deliberations, which is really what representative government is supposed to be. I mean, it's acknowledged that not every single citizen has the time and the wherewithal to kind of in-depth examine every complicated policy issue that's out there. So, that's what we do. We elect representative, essentially, to kind of do that work and hope in their judgment. And this is on a particular, very hands-on way. And by what they came up with, you can really see that they've taken into account or corrected for one of the two biggest problems is when you have political decisions, which is political leaders are focused on the short term and getting elected, or the same thing on Wall Street, where you have businesses and they're looking at quarterly returns or annual returns instead of the long picture. And it seems what was done here is really a kind of long-term view. And I agree with you. It's very encouraging.
I mean, it's nice when, I guess, you are resting on a cushion of $1.8 trillion.
That helps.
But Interested, Robin, in those priorities they identified, and regular listeners to this and other programmes on Monocle Radio will be aware that this broadcaster is himself something of a headbanger for massive government spending on things like education, foreign aid, national broadcasters, etc. If I was running for office, well, to finish that sentence, obviously, if I was running for office, I would lose. But one of the things I would say is, yeah, elect me, and I am going to absolutely shovel money at foreigners. You watch me go.
You should have been a Norwegian. You would have been elected in a heartbeat.
I can't speak the language, and I don't like winter.
Well, there you go. No, it's I do find it heartening. I was part of a process back in 2016 before the Brexit referendum in this country, where we convened a dozen people with different views on Brexit, sat them down as if they were a jury, and then presented them with a line of expert witnesses whom they could question and try to form a view. And it was absolutely fascinating to do exactly what Patty was describing. People who might not necessarily spend a great deal of their time thinking about political priorities,
because most people don't.
No,
which is no knock on those people. Absolutely. They do have lives to live.
Absolutely not. But if you sit them down in a room and say, for the next couple of hours, let's talk about some difficult decisions which governments will have to make, they do engage, and they find it interesting, they find it empowering, and by and large, they come to the kind of decisions that I would wish them to come to.
So people did change their minds?
Oh, yes. Not a lot of them, but some did.
Just finally on this, Patty, and thinking about this with an economics correspondent's hat on, how much power does it give Norway that their sovereign wealth fund has ethical strictures? They recently divested from Mexico's state oil company Pemex over corruption concerns. They pulled the plug on the Israeli energy firm Paz for supplying West Bank settlements. Again, if they've got that figure again, $1.8 trillion, they're quite influential, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, which is saying a lot when you think of like Persian Gulf countries that have incredible, oil and gas wealth. I don't think it's that unusual, though, if you think let's say, generalize it more, whether you're talking about government spending or endowment spending, universities and such often have ethical considerations that they take into account. Certainly, a lot of the divestment movements that have taken place in the United States going back to apartheid in South Africa were motivated by exactly that, and for people trying to get the institutions to divest of things that they thought were unethical, or projects or countries that they thought were unethical.
Well, to the United Kingdom, specifically to a report in the Telegraph, which must have greatly cheered the breakfasts of the insane retired brigadiers which constitute its core readership. It says here that at least half of Generation Z, i.e. approximately 18 to 24-year-olds, would like greater opportunity for military training associated with education, by way of response to the grand scheme of things. This apparent enthusiasm is, however, hard to square with the UK military's ongoing recruiting crisis. The British Army has a current strength of circa 72,000 full-time troops, the smallest it has been since circa Napoleon, though they won that one, what's the problem, and has only slightly more operable tanks than Switzerland, while the Royal Navy has decommissioned ships for want of sailors. Robin, would this necessarily be a terrible idea to, bring to bear an amount of square bashing and potato peeling on a British education?
Before I get to that, Andrew, I've got two questions about this particular story. I would love to know who commissioned the poll, and I would love to know exactly what questions they asked, because without that knowledge, it's really quite difficult to know what to make of it. But to your question, no, I don't think reintroducing military service or conscription or whatever you want to call it is a good idea. There are much better ways to prepare young people for the future. It is true, of course, that we live in a world that almost certainly is more dangerous than it was certainly at the end of the Cold War, 1989, 1990. But that doesn't mean that we have to encourage 18 to 24-year-olds all to don uniforms and start square bashing. What the story, such as it is, seems to suggest is that a lot of young people want to go into AI. A lot of them want to go into cyber security work. That doesn't surprise me. I mean, anybody with half a brain knows that is likely to be expanding job opportunities of the future. So, no, I don't think square bashing and donning uniforms is the future.
Patty, during your schooling, were there any opportunities for this sort of thing, and would you have availed yourself of them if there had been?
Well, first, I just want to kind of chime in with Robin on that. I'm incredibly suspect of this study.
You guys are no fun.
The other thing we don't even know is how many people they asked. May have been 7. But
I actually do hope our listeners are going to apply this rubric to every story they ever read based on results found by some attention-seeking corporate entity. They are usually, in fairness, absolute bollocks, but nevertheless,
exactly.
Throw us a bone here, Patty.
Yes, exactly. So, again, it's. I do think that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that there has been a clear shift in sentiment, certainly across Europe, as well as in the UK and the US, that much more money needs to be spent on defense, and that military spending, which was a kind of incredible opportunity following the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a peace dividend, and a lot of countries were able to devote a lot more money to other social areas or education, realize now they have to put more money into defense. In terms of careers in defense, I think, again, I happened to notice last night, I was watching and there was an ad for some branch of the British military. I'm not sure which one. But it kind of starts, with this kind of what looks like a kind of scary thing. And then you find out basically it's a guy who's taught how to do the electricity, and he'll have a great job after he gets out of the military. And that was the push. You're going to get training here that's going to enable you to get a job and a career after you finish here. So I think the military itself recognizes what is going to appeal to recruits, and I think that's ultimately the bottom line. Definitely not peeling potatoes.
Do we think that actually does appeal to recruits, though, Robin? Because when they go recruiting, especially making TV ads and so forth, they are caught in a bit of a bind in that they can't really admit what the core of the job is. Which is, to be possibly deployed abroad to kill people and blow things up. And they can't really recognise that for possibly quite a lot of people, that's not entirely unappealing.
They know that there are two big draws that they can offer to young people. They can offer the prospect of an exciting life, and they can offer the prospect of training for a useful skill. I did once, many years ago, as a reporter, spend a couple of days in an army recruiting office talking to young people coming in and asking them why they'd come in. It was during one of the UK recessions of the 1980s, and their answers were absolutely clear enough. They wanted to learn a skill which they could then use elsewhere. And the military do offer those skills. They offer very high-quality training in many cases. I don't think the majority of people who say they're interested in a career in the military want to go out and kill people. If that is what they want to do, then they should be turned down instantly.
Well, but those things are also kind of contingent in the atmosphere you're growing, that you're growing up in and what's going on in the world. Certainly in previous decades, those were exactly the appeals that were, do it for your country. After 9/11, there was a big uptick, I think, and if I remember correctly, in people joining the military and feeling like they wanted to serve their country and defend it. I know
personally of Americans who would never have dreamed of joining the military before 9/11 who did exactly that.
Exactly. And I don't know the answer to this. We'll have to ask these fantastic pollsters to do another survey. But I think also in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that really was a kind of very jolting wake-up call to Europe that, there is a kind of dangerous potential enemy on the border. And it has changed people's thinking in terms of support for the military and defense spending.
Paddy Cohen and Robin Lustig, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is, what with one thing and another, hard enough to get people to read books. How then to get people to read about books? This is the challenge confronted for a living by Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. I spoke to Gilbert earlier and began by asking about preserving the reputation of the New York Times Book Review amid the mayhem of the current media landscape.
It's been difficult in two ways. The first is that we still are, at least in the United States, the outlet that, writes about reviews, more books than any other. We want to sort of maintain that supremacy in the minds of our readers, but we also understand that what it means to write book reviews, to consume book reviews, has changed in the modern media environment that we are. And so the goal, the task, the difficulty is keeping your reputation while also understanding that you actually need to change in many ways, or you're going to lose people to all the other mediums that I think that we all know that we compete with. And so how do you write about books in a way that people want to read? And how do you do this thing, which I think is very important, which is how do you help them figure out what they're going to read next, which is not necessarily the point of a book review. But for anyone who is a passionate reader, that is one of the most important questions in their life. Every week and every month, what am I going to read next? It would be great if the New York Times Book Review was a place that they actually thought of as a place that would answer that question for them.
I do want to come back to that point, though, about how you adapt to the modern media landscape and how difficult those judgments are, because I've worked in and around media long enough to have witnessed multiple instances of a title or a section with a legacy and an identity to try and go chasing some sort of relevance and staking out some new audience only to find that it isn't there, and in the process they have thoroughly hacked off the loyal audience they already had.
That's my great fear. You're absolutely right. And I think it's the fear of anyone who is tasked with trying to keep a media outlet relevant right now. So, I've been in this job for 2.5 years, and the thing I said when I started was, we need to find new readers for the New York Times Book Review. Because if we don't, at some point in the not too distant future, we will have no more readers because all of our readers will have aged out. At the same point, the people who currently read us are so loyal and they have such high expectations in terms of the quality that we're going to deliver them, the quality writing, the quality of the books that we are picking. And this is a challenge. It's a challenge for the New York Times Book Review and really for anyone. How do you maintain your current audience and readership while also growing a new audience? So obviously, we are trying to go where people are. I have had to record vertical videos and go on TikTok, which is not something I thought I was going to have to do when I got this job. I host a podcast now, a weekly podcast, the Book Review podcast. We have other writers and editors who are having to put their faces out there into the world, put their voices into the world, because text is not the only way in which people learn about books. But we also still, every single week, publish several dozen well-written, diligently edited and fact-checked book reviews. Right. The goal is to keep doing that, is to keep publishing more than 1,000 book reviews a year, which is, I think, where we are, while also grappling with the reality that there are so many people out there that are passionate about books who will never read an issue of the New York Times Book Review. So how else can we read them?
It's a related issue, and it is one I've noticed in arts criticism generally. And I speak as somebody who came up as a rock journalist in the pre-internet era, where, especially in the British rock press, there was this kind of, I'm sure somewhat obnoxious, but kind of swagger to it, in that you would just dish out critical kickings left, right and centre, safe in the knowledge that your advertisers had nowhere else to go. And if any readers were going to get upset with you, they would have to go to all the trouble of actually writing a letter, and who could be bothered with that? It's not like that anymore, obviously, especially in that response from readers of the books that have been criticised, and perhaps even from the authors themselves. Do you notice that maybe reviewers are getting a little more timid, a little less, a little less relaxed about dishing out the proper old school critical battering when it's merited?
Absolutely. I mean, I've talked about this several times in the past few months with people on staff and friends of mine. I think it is true. So the New York Times Book Review has several staff critics, employees, but we also primarily use outside writers, novelists, academics, nonfiction writers to review books, novelists writing about novelists, historians writing about large pieces of nonfiction. And so these are people who are in that ecosystem. And the ecosystem is not great at the moment, right? You don't want to necessarily be, I can't speak for anyone in particular, but the writer who comes out and slams a fellow novelist because, God forbid, when it's your time to write a novel, someone will do that to you, right? That is a sense that I get. That I can't confirm that. I don't have facts or data, but it's a feeling that I have that people are just not as comfortable these days with writing negative reviews. If you're a staff critic at a place like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, I don't know if the Financial Times has staff critics, you have a little more stability. You know that if you write something that is negative and you anger people, you will have the backing of your institution. But the economics of arts criticism over the past many decades means that there are fewer and fewer of those staff jobs available. And so most of the people that are writing about books and movies and albums and TV shows are freelancers out there, and they need to sort of, maintain their viability at the same time. It is a very scary time to be a critic, to be frank.
I know one of the things that you've done recently in order to, I guess, prompt an amount of discussion is publishing things like a list of the 100 best books of the 21st century. Is that just distributed into the ether as a means of starting arguments among readers and attracting attention and prompting discourse? Or do you feel like you were actually able to impose an objective hierarchical rigor on the idea?
We tried to do both. It certainly was the former. So let's be frank about this. I think there was a survey released in the past year or two that said that 50% of Americans didn't even read a single book in the past year. I've read in the UK, there was a survey a couple months ago that was concerned about young people not reading books. And so part of our goal is to get people excited about books, which is not an easy thing to do. So as we're approaching, now we're in a quarter century has passed. We said, we're the New York Times. We're the New York Times Book Review. We have a relatively large staff of people who are expert in books. Let's try to take a first pass. Let's try to get an early handle on what we think the lasting works of English language literature might be. We reached out to 1,000 writers and other sort of literary luminaries, asked them to pick their 10 best books published since the year 2000 in the English language. We received 500 responses. And, as much as we could, stick to what the actual votes were, that is what we did. We didn't move books around in order to come up with a more interesting list. The number one book was My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. That is the one that got the most votes. The number 3 book was The Great Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. That is the book that got the 3rd most votes. We didn't sort of finagle around with it. But part of the reason we did it was because we wanted to make a splash. I mean, it's part of an outlet's job to try to use a little bit of the old razzle dazzle to get people excited about the things that they're writing about. And we think with this project, we did succeed.
That was Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, speaking to me earlier. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Patty Cohen and Robin Lustig. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Gilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.